U.S. Rangers laughed when a veteran showed up with a World War II rifle until his shot stunned them. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. The sun was setting behind the training grounds of the United States Rangers, casting long shadows over the range. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of military vehicles. A group of young Rangers, clad in their combat gear, were preparing for their routine sniper training. They were all gathered around, laughing and joking, their attention focused on the course ahead. Then, out of nowhere, an elderly man appeared, slowly wheeling himself onto the range with a weathered, old rifle resting in his lap. The sight of the man, dressed in a simple gray jacket and cap, caught the attention of the young Rangers. One of them, a brash private, scoffed and muttered under his breath, "What's this, some kind of joke?" The other Rangers chuckled, exchanging glances. The old man, his face lined with the wisdom of decades, didn't respond to their mockery. He simply sat in silence, observing the young men with steady, calm eyes. One of the Rangers, feeling bold, approached the man. "Hey, old-timer, you planning to shoot today, or just watch us train?" he asked with a smirk. The other Rangers snickered. The old man still didn't respond, but his gaze never left the target range. Another Ranger stepped forward, shaking his head. "You know, it's cute that you think you can still do this, but that rifle of yours." He gestured dismissively at the World War II-era rifle in the man's hands. "This isn't some antique show. You should leave the shooting to us." The old man didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his glasses and ran his fingers over the smooth wood of the rifle stock. The Rangers continued to laugh, making crude jokes at the expense of the elderly veteran. The private who had spoken earlier let out a loud, mocking laugh. "I bet this guy hasn't even held a rifle since World War II, he said. "Let me guess, he's here to teach us how to shoot with a musket?" The others laughed along, clearly enjoying the spectacle of the old man, who, despite their taunts, remained unfazed. The old man slowly looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've fired this rifle in battle. It's still good enough for me," he said softly. The young men paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The silence was thick, but it was quickly shattered by one of the older instructors, a gunnery sergeant who had been watching from a distance. He stepped forward and gave the old man a respectful nod. "Let him shoot," the gunnery sergeant ordered. "Let's see what he can do." The Rangers were taken aback, unsure whether this was some sort of test or just a bizarre moment in the day's training. The old man didn't waste time. He lifted the rifle with surprising ease, as if it were an extension of his own body. The target, set at over 500 yards, looked impossibly far for anyone to hit with such an old weapon. But the veteran aimed carefully, as if every shot he had taken in his life had led him to this moment. The wind was picking up, making the already difficult shot even more challenging. The young Rangers stood by, curious but skeptical. "There's no way," one of them muttered under his breath. "This is just for show." The old man adjusted his aim, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the target. The rifle kicked back slightly as he squeezed the trigger, the sound echoing across the range. For a split second, everything was still. Then, as the smoke cleared, the target was no longer standing. It had been hit dead center. The Rangers were stunned into silence, their faces a mix of disbelief and awe. They had been so sure that the old man was just a relic of the past, that he had nothing to offer. But in that one moment, the veteran had proven them all wrong. The gunnery sergeant, who had been watching quietly, nodded in approval. "That, gentlemen, is what real skill looks like." The young Rangers stood there, wide-eyed, as the old man lowered his rifle. He didn't need to say anything more. His shot had done all the talking. They had underestimated him, and now they could do nothing but respect him. As they began to gather around, the private who had mocked the veteran earlier approached him, a sheepish expression on his face. "Sir," he said quietly, "that was incredible. We didn't know." The old man simply smiled and placed his rifle back on his lap, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and humility. Sometimes, the past has a way of reminding us what really matters. he said, his voice calm and steady. The moment the old veteran lowered his rifle, the entire range was still. The rangers stood there, completely silent, trying to process what had just happened. A shot, made with an old World War II rifle, had hit the target dead center from 500 yards away. It wasn't just a shot, it was a statement. The young rangers, all proud and confident in their modern weapons and equipment, were now left in awe. It was clear that they had underestimated this man, this old veteran who had walked into their world as if he had never left it. As the dust settled, the gunny sergeant who had been watching stepped forward. His face was stoic, but there was a glint of respect in his eyes. He was the first to break the silence. "All right, gentlemen," he said, his voice low and commanding. "That right there is the kind of skill you can't put on a computer screen or measure with all the gadgets you've got." The other rangers, still processing what they had witnessed, shifted uncomfortably. They had never imagined that such an old man, with his weathered hands and faded jacket, could outshoot them. It didn't make sense. The private who had been the loudest in mocking the veteran stepped forward. His face was flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was just some old guy." The gunny sergeant shot him a sharp look, but didn't say anything. He knew what was going through the young man's head. It was the same thing that had gone through his own when he first saw the old veteran. "You're not the only one who underestimated him," the gunny said. "We all did." He turned to the veteran. "I'm sorry, sir. That was an impressive shot." The old man didn't speak right away. He simply nodded, his expression calm, unbothered by the attention he had just earned. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. But the respect in the air was palpable, and the rangers couldn't ignore it. "Thank you," the old man finally said, his voice steady and unshaken. "I've been doing this a long time. Sometimes it's not about the equipment. It's about the skill, the patience, and knowing when to take the shot." There was a pause as the young men took in his words. The gunny nodded in agreement. "He's right. You can have all the technology in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, it's just a tool." The private who had mocked the old man earlier, now genuinely curious, asked, "How long have you been shooting, sir?" The old man smiled, a slight, knowing smile. "Longer than you've been alive," he said. The words hit harder than any shot. The rangers exchanged glances, realizing just how much they had to learn. The old veteran wasn't just a man with a rifle. He was a living history of skill, experience, and perseverance. One of the rangers, a young man in his early 20s, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, do you mind telling us how you learned to shoot like that?" he asked. The old man looked at him, his eyes softening. "It wasn't just about shooting," he began, his voice growing more serious. "It was about survival. Every shot I made in the field was a choice between life and death. And when you're in a situation like that, you don't miss." His words were heavy, each one carrying the weight of years of experience. The rangers listened intently. They were used to hearing stories, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it was different. "It wasn't easy," the old man continued. "There were times when we didn't have the best gear, times when we had to make do with what we had. But what kept us alive wasn't the rifle or the gear. It was knowing how to use what we had. That's the real lesson." The gunny sergeant gave a low whistle. "That's something we could all learn," he said, his tone serious. "Skill over technology. That's what makes a true soldier." The old man nodded, pleased by the respect he was finally receiving. "Technology's great when it works," he said, "but it's the man behind the rifle that makes the difference." The atmosphere had shifted. The young rangers, who had initially mocked the old man, now stood in awe of him. They had seen the power of his experience and the depth of his knowledge. They realized that they weren't just learning about shooting, they were learning about life, about what it really means to be a soldier. The old veteran slowly stood up, his movements measured but purposeful. He looked at the rangers, who were now standing at attention, their faces serious. "I came here to do one thing," he said, his voice firm. "To remind you that no matter how advanced your tools are, it's your heart, your skill, and your will that truly count." The gunny sergeant, his voice full of respect, said, "Thank you, sir. You've given us all something to think about." The veteran nodded, satisfied. He didn't need to say more. His shot had already done the talking for him. With that, he slowly turned and walked off the range, leaving the rangers standing in silence, their minds racing with the lessons they had just learned. They would never forget this day, The day they realized that true skill couldn't be measured by the newest technology, but by the experience and heart of the person holding the rifle. The next day, the mood on the training grounds was different. The usual banter and casual mockery had been replaced by a quieter, more respectful atmosphere. The young Rangers, still processing the events from the day before, had a newfound sense of humility. They no longer saw the old man as just a relic of the past. He had shown them what true skill was, and now they understood that his experiences went far beyond any training they had received. The old man, whose name they had now learned was John Miller, had become something of a legend in their eyes. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a living testament to the kind of soldier they all aspired to be. The gunny sergeant, who had initially been skeptical, was the first to speak up. "All right, listen up, Rangers. We've got a new assignment today. But before we begin, I want you to remember something. What happened here yesterday was no accident. It wasn't luck. It was experience. John Miller has forgotten more about shooting than most of us will ever know. And you should all be grateful for the lesson he gave you." The Rangers, now serious, nodded in acknowledgement. The playful attitude that had defined their earlier days of training was gone, replaced by a focus that came from respect. As they prepared for the day's drill, John Miller quietly observed from the sidelines. He wasn't here to take charge. He was here to share what he had learned over decades of service, to pass on the knowledge that he knew could save lives. One of the younger Rangers, a lance corporal who had been particularly vocal in his mockery the day before, approached him. "Sir," he said, his voice tentative, "I was wrong. Yesterday, I didn't know who you were. But now I see it. You taught us something I didn't think was possible. I just wanted to say thank you." John Miller smiled, but it was a small, almost imperceptible gesture. He didn't need accolades. He was here for one reason only, to make them better. "You're welcome," he said softly. "But don't thank me just yet. You've got a long way to go before you understand what it truly means to be a soldier." The lance corporal nodded, his respect now fully earned. The rest of the day passed in a focused silence, the Rangers applying themselves to the tasks at hand. The training was difficult, as it always was, but there was something different about the way they approached it now. They weren't just going through the motions. They were learning, not just from their instructors, but from the legacy of those who had come before them. Later that evening, the gunny sergeant called the unit together for a final briefing. "Listen up," he began. "I've got something important to say. You're all here because you've shown potential. You've got the skills, but there's one thing you've got to remember. This isn't just about completing a mission. It's about carrying on a legacy. A legacy of men like John Miller, who've been through the worst and come out stronger. You've got to learn to respect that, because one day, you'll be the ones teaching the next generation." The Rangers stood in silence, their minds working over the words. John Miller, who had been standing off to the side, approached the group. The gunny sergeant motioned for him to speak, but John simply nodded and turned to the young men before him. "The real test," John began, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "isn't how well you can shoot or how fast you can complete a mission. It's about how well you can endure. The battlefield doesn't care how young or old you are. It doesn't care what gear you have or how advanced your technology is. What matters is what you bring to it. Your courage, your resilience, and your ability to keep going when everything else fails." He paused, looking each of them in the eye. "Remember that. Don't just be soldiers. Be warriors." With that, John Miller turned and walked away, his figure slowly disappearing into the evening light. The Rangers watched him go, their respect now deep and unwavering. They understood, in that moment, that they had learned something far more valuable than any skill they could be taught on the range. They had learned what it meant to truly be a soldier. As the sun set behind the training grounds, the Rangers stood a little taller, their heads held higher. They had been shown the path, and now, it was up to them to walk it. The days of mockery and arrogance were behind them. In their place was a deep, unshakable respect for the man who had lived through it all and the lessons he had imparted. The training was far from over, but now they knew it wasn't just about the drills and exercises. It was about carrying forward the legacy of those who had come before them. They were ready to earn their place in that legacy. The following week, the training grounds at the United States Ranger Base were as intense as ever. But something had shifted. The usual energy, the cocky, competitive spirit that drove the young Rangers to push themselves, had taken on a new layer. They were more focused now, not just on the drills and exercises, but on the deeper lessons they had learned. The gunny sergeant noticed it immediately. He had been observing their progress, and the change was undeniable. It wasn't just the old man's shot that had made an impact. It was his wisdom, his quiet strength, and the way he had earned their respect without saying a word. They had seen something in him that they hadn't realized they were missing. Now, as they gathered around for another training exercise, the gunny sergeant called them to attention. "All right, Rangers," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "Today's exercise is going to test everything you've learned. But more than that, it's going to show you what you're made of." The Rangers nodded, their faces serious. The gunny sergeant had been tough on them since the day they'd arrived, and they knew this would be no different. "We've been focusing on the basics, but today, you're going to be tested in a way that matters most," he continued. "You're going to make decisions under pressure. You're going to be faced with situations where your instinct will be the only thing that gets you through." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And remember this, it's not about the gear you have. It's about how well you know your training, and how well you can trust yourself when everything else is falling apart." The tension in the air was palpable. The young men who had been laughing and joking a few weeks ago now stood at attention, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. As the exercise began, the Rangers moved out in teams. Their objective was to navigate a course that simulated real-life combat scenarios. They were to move quickly and decisively, making calls in the heat of the moment. The first challenge was a series of simulated enemy positions. The Rangers, armed with their rifles and gear, moved silently through the woods. They communicated in quick whispers, each movement calculated, each decision deliberate. As they approached the first checkpoint, a loud crack split the air. One of the Rangers, a private who had been struggling with his confidence, froze. The sound of a distant shot made him hesitate, his thoughts racing. But then, something clicked. He remembered the lesson from the old man, how it wasn't about the equipment or the technology, but about being able to adapt. His eyes focused, his breathing slowed, and he moved forward, taking the shot. The target dropped, and the team moved on. By the end of the course, every Ranger had faced a challenge that tested their skills, their instincts, and their ability to make split-second decisions. But it wasn't just about the physical challenges. It was about mental toughness, and the veterans' words echoed in their minds. It's about knowing how to use what you've got, no matter how old or new it is. As the day came to an end, the gunny sergeant gathered the Rangers again. His eyes scanned their faces, noting the fatigue, but also the sense of pride that had replaced the cocky confidence they had started with. "You've all come a long way," he said, his voice softer now, but still filled with authority. "You've learned the basics. But today, you learned something far more important: how to trust your instincts and rely on your training." The Rangers nodded, their faces serious. The old man's lessons had not only shaped their skills, but had also shaped their understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. The gunny sergeant stepped forward, his gaze lingering on each of them. "You're no longer just recruits," he said. "You've earned the right to be called Rangers." There was a moment of silence, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just a title, it was a responsibility that they now carried with honor. Later that evening, as the Rangers sat around the fire, they found themselves talking less about the drills and more about the lessons they had learned. They shared stories, exchanged ideas, and, for the first time, truly respected the experiences of each other. The old man, John Miller, had unknowingly brought them together. His humility, his quiet confidence, had set the tone for the team to follow. As the stars shone brightly above, the Rangers knew that they were no longer just a group of soldiers. They were a unit, a brotherhood, forged in the heat of training and solidified by the lessons of those who had come before them. The next morning, as they gathered for the final exercise, the gunny sergeant addressed them one last time. "Today, we wrap up this phase of training. But remember, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. What you've learned here is the foundation. What you do with it, how you carry it forward, is what defines you as a Ranger." The words resonated deeply within each of them. They were ready to take the next step, ready to become the soldiers they had been trained to be. The journey was far from over, but they now had the strength, the knowledge, and the unity to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning after their final training exercise, the air on the grounds felt different, more purposeful. The usual hum of activity was tinged with an air of anticipation. The young Rangers had learned more than just tactics in the past weeks. They had learned what it meant to truly respect those who came before them. John Miller, the old veteran who had walked into their lives and turned their world upside down, was now more than just a distant figure of war. He was a symbol of everything they aspired to be. As they gathered for the final debriefing, the gunny sergeant stood at the front, scanning their faces with a level of scrutiny that only someone who had seen the worst of battle could muster. He had seen the transformation in his team over the past few days. The cocky smiles had faded, replaced by determination and respect. "All right, Rangers," the gunny sergeant began, his voice gruff but filled with pride. "You've all done well. But today's challenge is different. We're not here to measure your skills with a rifle or your speed on the course. Today, you're going to face something far more difficult, a test of your leadership and your ability to think under pressure." The Rangers exchanged looks, the weight of his words sinking in. They had trained for everything: the physical endurance, the sniper drills, the combat scenarios. But leadership was something that could not be taught in drills. It had to be earned in the heat of the moment, through experience. "You're going to lead a team through a series of simulated combat situations," the gunny sergeant continued. "The goal isn't to complete the mission. It's to show that you can make decisions, take responsibility, and bring your team home. A real leader doesn't just command. They guide, they protect, and they trust their team. This is where you prove that you're ready to carry the title of Ranger." The Rangers listened intently, their focus razor-sharp. John Miller, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped forward as the gunny sergeant finished speaking. His weathered face was stoic, but his eyes held a glint of approval. "You've all got the skills," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a lifetime of service. "But now, you've got to prove you can be the kind of soldiers that others can trust with their lives. It's not about being the best on your own. It's about making sure everyone around you is just as capable. That's the mark of a true leader." With those words, the final exercise began. The Rangers were split into teams and tasked with navigating a mock urban battlefield. Their mission was to clear the area of simulated threats, provide medical aid to their injured teammates, and make split-second decisions in the face of constant danger. Each of them would take turns leading their teams through various stages of the operation. As they entered the mock battlefield, the atmosphere shifted. The simulated sounds of gunfire, explosions, and radio chatter filled the air. The team leaders had to keep their wits about them, make quick decisions, and communicate effectively. Every action they took would ripple through the entire team, and they knew that one wrong move could lead to failure. The first few minutes were chaotic. Rangers ran from cover to cover, dodging simulated enemy fire and taking positions. But as the exercise wore on, something shifted. They stopped thinking like individuals and began to think like a unit. The team leaders took charge, directing their teammates with confidence. They assessed the situation, planned their movements, and executed their strategies with precision. As John Miller observed from a distance, he saw something he hadn't seen when they first arrived: a cohesive unit, working as one. They were no longer just soldiers. They were a team. They were Rangers. By the time the exercise concluded, the Rangers were exhausted but proud. They had learned the value of leadership, communication, and trust. They had seen firsthand the weight of responsibility that came with leading others, and they had risen to the occasion. As they gathered back at the staging area, the gunny sergeant stood before them once again. His face was hard to read, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "You've earned something today," he said, his voice firm. "You've earned the title of Ranger. You've proven you have the skills, the heart, and the leadership it takes to be the best. Now, you've got to live up to it every day." The words hit hard, not as a challenge, but as a reminder of the responsibility they now carried. The title of Ranger wasn't just given. It was earned, and it was something they had to continue proving every day. As they walked off the field, their minds buzzing with the lessons of the day, they knew they had come a long way. They had faced the challenges of physical training, mental toughness, and leadership, and they had passed each one. But they also knew this was just the beginning. The real work started now. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were Rangers, and they had a duty to uphold the legacy that came with that title. The following days were a turning point for the Rangers. They had earned their title, but with it came a new set of expectations, and they knew that they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The gunny sergeant had made it clear: being a Ranger wasn't just about passing training, or completing missions. It was about carrying the weight of the title every single day. As the weeks passed, their training intensified. The physical drills became more grueling, the mental challenges more demanding, and the leadership tasks more complex. But amidst all the physical and tactical training, there was one thing that lingered with the young Rangers: John Miller's words. He had shown them what it meant to be a soldier, and those lessons were still fresh in their minds. During one late-night debrief, after a particularly difficult day on the course, the gunny sergeant called them all together for a final reflection. "All right, Rangers, gather up," he said, his voice gravelly from a long day's work. "We're nearing the end of your training, but before we move on to the next phase, I want to hear from you. What have you learned?" The question hung in the air. The Rangers exchanged glances. They had learned so much in such a short time, and now they had to put it into words. Finally, one of the younger Rangers, a guy named Roberts, spoke up. "I think we've learned what it really means to be part of something bigger," he said, his voice steady. "It's not just about the gear, or the rifle, or the training. It's about the people next to you. You rely on each other, and you trust each other. That's what makes you a team." The gunny sergeant nodded, his lips curling into a slight smile. "Good answer," he said. "What else?" Another ranger, a tall and quiet one named Pierce, added, "It's also about knowing when to step up and lead. Not just taking charge, but knowing when to listen, when to follow, and when to make the tough decisions." The gunny gave a low whistle. "Exactly. Leadership is more than just barking orders. It's about guiding your team, knowing when to take control, and when to let someone else step up. You've all learned that over the past few weeks." The Rangers nodded, their respect for each other growing with every word. And then, as if on cue, one of them spoke up again, this time with more uncertainty. "And what about the old man?" he asked, glancing toward the far corner of the room, where John Miller was sitting silently, watching. "What do we do with that? The stuff he taught us? He's not a part of the army anymore, but I don't know. It feels like he's still teaching us something." The gunny sergeant's eyes narrowed as he thought for a moment. Then he stood up, his posture stiff with pride. "You listen to that old man," he said, his voice commanding. "Every word he says. He's not just a veteran. He's a legend. And what he knows, what he's been through, can't be taught in any training manual or in any course. He's forgotten more about war than most of us will ever learn." The room fell silent. The Rangers had heard the stories, the whispers about John Miller's past, the heroics, the wars fought, the lives saved. But they had never truly understood the depth of what he had experienced. "You know," the gunny sergeant continued, "it's not just about what he's done. It's about how he carries it. He doesn't walk around with a chip on his shoulder or boast about his accomplishments. He's quiet. He's humble. And that, gentlemen, is something we can all learn from. There's power in humility. There's strength in silence. And there's wisdom in age." The gunny's words struck a chord with every single one of them. They had spent so much time focusing on themselves, on becoming the best versions of soldiers they could be, that they had almost forgotten the deeper lessons. John Miller was showing them that it wasn't always about being the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes, it was about enduring, staying steady, and showing up when it counted. As the evening drew to a close, the gunny sergeant dismissed the Rangers for the night. "Get some rest," he said, his tone softening. "Tomorrow's another day, and it's going to be a tough one." As the men made their way to the barracks, they couldn't help but think about the old man sitting in the corner, observing them with those steady, knowing eyes. What had he seen? What had he experienced that they could only begin to imagine? The next morning, the Rangers were called to the range for their final live-fire exercise. It was the culmination of everything they had been training for, a test of their physical, mental, and tactical readiness. As they arrived, they saw John Miller standing off to the side, watching them. He wasn't there to teach them any more lessons. But somehow, it felt like he was still guiding them. They went through the drills, firing at targets from different positions, moving under fire, and executing complex maneuvers. The young Rangers felt the weight of the moment. They were no longer just soldiers in training. They were warriors, carrying the legacy of those who had gone before them. As the exercise ended, the gunny sergeant gathered them together one last time. "You've done it," he said, his voice thick with pride. "You've made it through the hardest training you'll ever face. But remember this, being a ranger isn't about finishing the mission. It's about how you carry the mission with you every single day." He turned to John Miller, who had been standing quietly, his arms crossed. "And gentlemen, remember the man who taught you what it means to be a soldier. Not just with his words, but with his actions." The Rangers looked at John Miller, and for the first time, they didn't just see an old man. They saw a living legend, one who had shown them not just how to be a soldier, but how to be a man. The respect they felt for him was unspoken, but clear. He had earned it, not with flashy displays of strength, but with quiet dignity, experience, and wisdom. They had learned more from him than they could ever express, and now, they would carry those lessons with them, always. Weeks had passed since the final live-fire exercise, and the Rangers had settled into their routines. The days were long, filled with intense drills and missions that tested their physical and mental limits. They had earned their place as Rangers, but the real work had only just begun. The unit had become a well-oiled machine, moving in sync, communicating without words, and executing their tasks with precision. But something was different now. It wasn't just the confidence they had gained through their training. It was the quiet strength they had learned from John Miller. His lessons, though simple, had shaped them in ways they hadn't fully realized at first. It wasn't just about being the best with their rifles or completing a mission. It was about showing up every day, working with humility, and leading by example. One morning, the Rangers were called into the briefing room for a surprise assignment. The atmosphere was different today, tense, but not in a bad way. There was an edge of anticipation in the air. They could tell this mission would be something significant. As they gathered around, the gunny sergeant stepped forward, holding a file in his hands. "All right, Rangers," he began, his voice low and steady. "We've got a new mission. This isn't your standard operation. We've been called to assist in a high-priority mission involving an unknown threat, and it's going to test everything you've learned." The room was silent, every Ranger's attention focused on the gunny. "The objective is to move in, assess the situation, and neutralize any threats, but there's one catch. You're going to have to make decisions on the fly. No backup, no second chances. You've got to rely on your training, your instincts, and your ability to think like a team." The Rangers exchanged looks, the weight of the mission sinking in. This wasn't a simple training exercise. This was real. As the briefing continued, the gunny emphasized the importance of communication, trust, and leadership. The lessons they had learned from their time with John Miller were fresh in their minds, and now, they would have to put them to use in the field. They geared up quickly, the familiar weight of their equipment, now something they could rely on. Each Ranger knew their role and trusted the others to do their part. John Miller, as always, was there to observe, his steady gaze watching as the team prepared. He wasn't there to give orders or direct them. He was there to watch them apply what they had learned. It was their time to prove themselves. The mission began under the cover of darkness. The Rangers moved silently through the terrain, their movements smooth and practiced. As they advanced toward their objective, the tension built. They knew the enemy could be anywhere, but they were prepared. Every step they took was calculated, every sound analyzed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a distant noise, footsteps. The team froze, and instinctively, they formed a tight perimeter. The gunny sergeant gave a subtle hand signal, and they moved into position. As they crouched behind cover, one of the Rangers, a sharp-eyed sniper named Harris, scanned the area through his scope. He signaled to the team, two hostiles approaching, unaware of their presence. "We take them out quietly," the gunny sergeant whispered, his voice steady. "Remember, it's not just about the shot. It's about timing and coordination." The Rangers nodded, each of them knowing their role. Harris took the first shot, and the target fell without a sound. The second Ranger, a young officer named Davis, moved quickly to neutralize the second threat. It was seamless. They had executed it perfectly. The rest of the mission unfolded in a similar fashion. They moved with precision, using their training to assess the situation and make decisions in real time. As the mission drew to a close, they successfully completed their objective, neutralizing the threats and securing the area. When they returned to base, their faces were a mixture of exhaustion and pride. They had faced a real-world challenge, and they had come out on top. The gunny sergeant gathered them together, his eyes scanning the group. "You did well out there," he said, his voice full of pride. "But remember this is only one mission. You've got to keep improving, keep learning, and keep pushing yourselves. Being a Ranger isn't just about what you do in the field. It's about what you do every day. The Rangers nodded, their respect for the gunny deepening. But there was something else. They had earned their place as a team, but it was the lessons from John Miller that had truly shaped them. As they looked around at each other, they realized that they were no longer just a group of soldiers. They were brothers, united by shared experiences and mutual respect. Later that night, as they gathered around the campfire, the conversation shifted. They talked about the mission, about the challenges they had faced, but they also talked about John Miller. The old veteran wasn't there with them physically, but his presence was felt in every decision they made, every shot they took, every command they followed. It was clear now that his lessons had become a part of who they were. "I don't think we'd have made it through this mission without him," said Pierce, his voice thoughtful. The others nodded in agreement. "Yeah," Roberts added. "He taught us more than just how to shoot. He taught us what it means to be a real soldier, to lead with honor and to follow with humility." The night wore on, and as the stars twinkled above, the Rangers knew that they had earned something that couldn't be measured in awards or titles. They had earned the trust of their brothers, the respect of their commanders, and the quiet strength of those who had come before them. They were Rangers now, truly and completely. The weeks that followed felt like a test, not just of skill, but of the core lessons they had learned from John Miller. The Rangers had earned their place among the best, but now they faced a new challenge, one that went beyond anything they had encountered so far. A new mission had arrived, one that would push them to their limits and beyond. The mission brief came in just after sunrise. The unit had been tasked with a search and rescue operation deep in hostile territory. There had been a crash, a military aircraft, down behind enemy lines. It was a complex mission. There were no guarantees, and the terrain was unforgiving. The Rangers would need to move swiftly, silently, and decisively. Every step they took would be dangerous, every decision a potential life or death situation. As they assembled for the mission, the tension in the air was thick. The gunny sergeant stood at the front, his usual no-nonsense demeanor replaced by a rare solemnity. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We've trained for moments like this. We've trained for the hard calls, for the unknowns. Now it's time to put everything we've learned into action. Stay sharp, follow your training, but remember, this mission isn't just about the mission. It's about getting our people home." The team nodded in unison. The old veterans' words, those quiet lessons that had been ingrained in their minds, echoed in their thoughts. They weren't just soldiers now. They were a brotherhood, bound by respect, by duty, and by the lessons passed down to them. As they moved out, the terrain proved to be more difficult than they had anticipated. The thick forest gave way to muddy trails, jagged rocks, and dense underbrush. The path was treacherous, and the enemy could be lurking anywhere. The Rangers kept a tight formation, moving in silence, their steps light but purposeful. The farther they ventured, the more intense the feeling of danger became. There was no backup coming. No one else knew exactly where they were. It was up to them, and them alone, to succeed. As the team reached the crash site, the gravity of the mission hit them. The wreckage was scattered, twisted metal and charred remnants of the aircraft. The area was eerily quiet, but the Rangers knew that silence meant nothing. The enemy could strike at any moment. The gunny sergeant waved the team forward, and they quickly moved to secure the area. The pilot was alive but badly injured. There was no time to waste. As they began to administer first aid, one of the younger Rangers, Private Davis, noticed something, movement in the distance. The enemy was closing in. "We've got company," he whispered urgently. The team immediately went into action. The gunny sergeant's voice cut through the chaos, issuing orders with precision. "Davis, cover our 6. Harris, you're with me. The rest of you, from a perimeter. We're not leaving without the pilot." The Rangers worked with military efficiency, covering each other's backs, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The situation was rapidly escalating, and every second counted. Harris, the team sniper, found a high ground and took position, his eyes scanning the horizon through his scope. 3 targets, moving in from the east, he reported. "Ready when you are." The gunny sergeant didn't hesitate. "Fire when ready. Don't let them get too close." As the first enemy soldier appeared in Harris's sights, the quiet crack of the sniper rifle echoed through the trees. The shot was clean, and the target dropped without a sound. The Rangers reacted instantly, their training kicking in. They moved to secure the area, knowing the clock was ticking. With the pilot stabilized and the area cleared, the Rangers prepared to exfiltrate. But as they began to move out, an unexpected explosion rocked the ground. A landmine, buried deep in the earth, had gone off nearby. The blast sent shockwaves through the team, knocking them off balance. It was chaos. The sound of gunfire erupted from all directions, and the Rangers were forced to fight their way through the chaos. In the midst of the mayhem, John Miller's lessons rang true. It wasn't just about the shots they took. It was about the decisions they made. It was about thinking on their feet, adapting to the situation, and leading their team through the storm. The gunny sergeant was the first to move, his voice cutting through the noise. "Stay focused. We get the pilot out. No one gets left behind." They fought their way forward, inch by inch, relying on the lessons they had learned about teamwork, trust, and leadership. When they finally made it to the extraction point, the pilot was safe, and the enemy was in retreat. The mission had been a success, but at a cost. The Rangers were tired, battered, and covered in dirt and blood, but they had done it. As they waited for the extraction team to arrive, the gunny sergeant gathered them once again. "You did good," he said, his voice hoarse. "You did exactly what you needed to do. But remember, this doesn't stop here. This is just the beginning. You've earned your place as Rangers. Now, you've got to keep proving it. Every day, every mission." The Rangers stood there, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits high. They had faced a real challenge and had come through stronger than ever. The old man's lessons, the lessons of leadership, humility, and resilience, had been with them every step of the way. They were no longer just soldiers. They were Rangers, ready for whatever came next. The mission had tested everything the Rangers had learned: their training, their trust in each other, and their ability to stay calm under pressure. As they boarded the transport helicopter that would carry them back to base, the weight of the mission began to settle in. They had accomplished their objective, but the aftermath was a quiet reminder of how fragile success in combat could be. The bruises and cuts, the dirt caked into their uniforms, were all physical reminders of the toll that had been taken. But there was something else that lingered, the lessons learned not just through combat, but from John Miller, the man who had unknowingly prepared them for moments like these. As the helicopter lifted off, the Rangers sat in silence, looking out at the vast expanse of land below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the horizon. The wind from the blades roared in their ears, but the inside of the helicopter was quiet, save for the occasional murmur between the men. John Miller was with them, but not in the way they had expected. He had not been there to give orders or take part in the fight. Instead, he had been there to observe, to guide them with his presence, his quiet wisdom. They had all followed his example, staying steady, being patient, and trusting each other. And now, as they flew back to base, they understood that those lessons were just as valuable as any tactical skill they had learned. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the silence. "We're about 15 minutes out," he said. "Get ready to move out. We'll be landing in the next few." The Rangers nodded, straightening up as they prepared to disembark. When the helicopter touched down, the familiar sounds of the base filled their ears. The buzzing of equipment, the clatter of soldiers moving about, and the distant hum of vehicles all signaled the return to normalcy. But for the Rangers, there was no such thing as normal anymore. They had seen too much, learned too much, to ever return to the way things were before. As they unloaded their gear and moved toward the debriefing area, the gunny sergeant met them with a solemn nod. "You did good out there," he said. "Real good. But don't get too comfortable. There's always more work to be done." The words were expected, but they still carried weight. The Rangers knew that the real test had only just begun. Inside the debriefing room, they were briefed on their next set of missions, but the conversation quickly turned to the old veteran, John Miller. "He's something else, isn't he?" Pierce, one of the Rangers, spoke up. "We would have never made it through that mission without what he taught us." The gunny sergeant looked at the men, his face hard but his eyes showing a flicker of respect. "Miller's been through more than most of us could imagine. What you learned from him was worth its weight in gold. You carry that with you, every mission you go on." The Rangers nodded, understanding the depth of what the gunny was saying. They weren't just learning how to fight. They were learning how to be soldiers, how to lead, how to endure. "Remember," the gunny continued, "it's not just about the mission or the equipment. It's about how you carry yourselves, how you lead, how you make decisions in the heat of battle. After the debriefing, the Rangers returned to their barracks. The atmosphere was different now. The jokes, the playful banter, had faded into the background. They were no longer just a group of young soldiers going through the motions. They were becoming what they had trained to be, true Rangers. As they sat around the mess hall, they talked about the mission, but it wasn't just about the details of what had happened. They talked about the lessons learned, the way they had moved as a team, and how their bond had grown stronger because of it. The older Rangers, the ones who had been through more combat, shared stories of their own experiences, but there was something different now. The younger ones listened with a new level of respect. They didn't see their fellow Rangers as just veterans of the past. They saw them as mentors, men who had endured, who had fought, and who had come out the other side stronger. As the night wore on, and the Rangers headed back to their bunks, the thoughts of the day stayed with them. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also men who had learned what it truly meant to be a brother, a leader, and a warrior. They had John Miller to thank for that. The quiet man who had taught them the most important lessons of all, how to be humble, how to endure, and how to lead with honor. As the lights dimmed and the men fell into their beds, one thought ran through their minds. They were ready for whatever came next. They had earned the right to call themselves Rangers, but the real work, the real test, would come in the days ahead. The next morning, the Rangers found themselves back in familiar territory, but everything felt different. The air was thick with the weight of responsibility, and even the routine drills seemed more intense. The lessons from the past weeks, from the grueling missions to the quiet wisdom of John Miller, had reshaped them. They were no longer just soldiers going through the motions. They were Rangers, bound by a common purpose and a newfound respect for what it meant to serve. As the gunny sergeant called them to assemble for their morning briefing, the sense of focus in the air was palpable. There was no joking, no banter. The men stood in formation, eyes forward, ready for whatever came next. The gunny sergeant wasted no time. All right, listen up. We've got a new mission coming down the pipe. This one's different, though. It's a real test. Not just of your skills, but of everything we've been training for. It's about leadership. It's about making tough calls under pressure. And it's about working together. We've got intel on a high-value target in the region. Your job is to locate, secure, and extract. Simple, right? The gunny paused for a beat, letting the weight of his words sink in. But here's the catch. The target isn't a heavily fortified area. We're going to be up against a well-armed enemy. There will be no room for mistakes. If we don't execute with precision, we'll be in the fight of our lives. You've been trained to handle pressure, but this mission will test you in ways you've never experienced. As the team loaded up their gear and prepared for the mission, there was a sense of quiet determination. The earlier missions had shown them what they were capable of, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher. The gunny sergeant's words echoed in their minds. Leadership, tough calls, working together. The Rangers had learned what those words truly meant in the field, and now it was time to prove it. The team moved out under the cover of darkness, their movements fluid, synchronized. They approached the target area cautiously, their senses on high alert. They knew the enemy was close, and they couldn't afford to be careless. Harris, the team's sniper, took up his position at a vantage point, scanning the area through his scope. "I've got eyes on the target," he said quietly over the radio. "2 guards on the perimeter. We're clear for now, but it won't be long before they start patrolling." The gunny sergeant's voice crackled in their earpieces. "Copy that, Harris. Stay sharp. We move on my mark." As they waited for the signal, the tension was thick. The mission was unfolding just as they had trained for, but this time, they had more to lose. As the gunny gave the order, the Rangers moved with precision. They slipped through the shadows, using the terrain to their advantage. The enemy patrols were close, but the Rangers were silent as ghosts. They reached the compound's outer walls and began their breach. The first few seconds of the operation went smoothly. They had entered without alerting the guards, but as they moved deeper into the compound, the tension ratcheted up. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and the team froze. The gunny signaled for them to hold position, his hand raised to the air. The silence was deafening. They could hear the enemy soldiers' boots getting closer. It was a split-second decision. Do they wait it out, or do they act? The gunny sergeant's calm voice broke the tension. "Take him out quietly," he ordered. The sniper's shot was swift and silent, the target falling before he could even react. The Rangers continued their advance. They had entered the compound, but the hardest part was still to come. The deeper they moved, the more intense the resistance became. The rooms were filled with enemy soldiers, and every turn brought them closer to the heart of the compound where their target was held. At one point, they encountered a barricade. The path forward was blocked, and the decision had to be made quickly. The gunny sergeant glanced at his team. "We can't go back. We push forward." "You know what to do," he said. There was no hesitation in his voice. The team moved with coordinated effort, pushing forward, clearing rooms, and neutralizing threats along the way. Every decision had consequences, but each move brought them closer to their objective. As they reached the final room where the target was being held, they encountered heavy resistance. The door was locked, and they had to force their way in. The gunny sergeant gave the order, and within moments, the door was breached. The enemy inside had no time to react. The target was located, secured, and the extraction plan was put into motion. As the team made their way to the extraction point, a barrage of gunfire erupted around them. The enemy had regrouped and was closing in fast. It was a race against time. The Rangers had trained for moments like this, moments when everything went wrong, and the only option was to press forward. The firefight was intense. The Rangers moved as one, covering each other's backs and using every ounce of training they had to stay alive. The gunny sergeant led the charge, guiding them through the chaos. As they reached the extraction point, the helicopter was waiting, its blades slicing through the air. They had made it. They had completed the mission, but it wasn't the mission itself that left them changed. It was the way they had worked together, the way they had trusted each other, and the leadership they had shown under fire. The gunny sergeant met them with a nod of approval. "You did it," he said simply. "You did exactly what you needed to do. You led when you had to, you followed when you had to, and you made it through because you trust each other. That's what being a Ranger is all about." As they climbed aboard the helicopter, the Rangers didn't need to say anything. They knew. They had faced their greatest test yet and come through as a team. They were no longer just soldiers. They were brothers, ready for whatever the future held. The days that followed the mission felt like a blur. The Rangers had returned to base, but the intensity of the operation stayed with them. They had proven themselves, not only to their commanders, but to each other. They were more than a unit now. They were a brotherhood forged through blood, sweat, and shared experiences. As they settled back into the rhythm of daily life, the gunny sergeant had a new mission for them, a training exercise that would test their skills in ways they hadn't imagined. The unit gathered early that morning for a debriefing. The gunny sergeant's expression was serious, and as he began speaking, the Rangers knew this was no ordinary drill. "All right, Rangers," the gunny sergeant began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "This isn't going to be easy. We're not out here just for another round of target practice. This exercise will be about decision-making under pressure. You've been through a lot together, but now we're going to push you beyond what you think you're capable of." The team exchanged looks, a mixture of anticipation and nerves. The gunny sergeant's words had a way of making the simplest tasks sound like life-or-death challenges. "You'll be put into a series of unpredictable situations, each designed to test your ability to make the right call under pressure," he continued. "You'll be leading small teams, and every decision you make will have consequences. This isn't just about hitting targets or clearing rooms. It's about surviving and getting everyone out alive." The Rangers braced themselves, knowing that the next few days would be as grueling as any combat mission. The exercise began at dawn, with the Rangers moving through the training area, navigating unfamiliar terrain, and responding to simulated threats. It was a chaotic, unpredictable environment. One moment, they were ambushing an enemy position. The next, they were providing first aid to a wounded teammate. As the day wore on, the scenarios became increasingly complex. They had to make life-or-death decisions on the fly, whether to take a shot, whether to engage, whether to retreat or press forward. But through it all, one thing stood out: their ability to work together. They had learned to trust each other in ways they hadn't realized before. Every decision they made was based on the trust they had built over the past few months. As the exercise came to a close, the Rangers were exhausted, physically and mentally drained. They had passed the test, but it had come at a cost. Some of them had been pushed to their limits, and others had come close to making mistakes that could have cost lives. But through it all, they had stood by each other, and that made all the difference. The gunny sergeant gathered them together at the end of the day, his expression unreadable. "You did well today," he said, his voice steady. "But don't think this is the end of the line. There's always more to learn, more to improve. You've proven yourselves, but the real test is how you continue to grow, how you face the challenges ahead." The Rangers stood in silence, their minds processing the weight of his words. They had come far, but they knew the road ahead would be long. As they made their way back to their barracks, the team reflected on the day's events. They had made mistakes, but they had learned from them. They had faced challenges they weren't prepared for, but they had come through stronger, more united. That night, as they sat around the mess hall, the conversation turned to their shared experiences. They talked about the tough moments of the exercise, but more than that, they talked about the way they had worked together. They had learned, in the heat of the moment, that leadership wasn't just about being in charge. It was about knowing when to step back, when to trust others, and when to make the hard call. And they had learned that true strength didn't come from individual ability, but from the strength of the team. As the weeks passed, the Rangers continued to train and improve. They faced new challenges, each more difficult than the last. But the bond they had formed, the lessons they had learned from each other and from John Miller, carried them through. The gunny sergeant was right. The real test wasn't just about surviving the mission. It was about how they carried themselves every day. They were no longer just soldiers. They were Rangers, and they knew that with every mission, they had to prove that they were worthy of the title. One evening, as the Rangers gathered for a rare moment of downtime, they found themselves reflecting on how far they had come. They had faced the worst and come out stronger. They had learned what it meant to be a team, to be leaders, and to be men of honor. As the night settled in, the words of John Miller echoed in their minds. "It's not about the gear, or the rank, or the title. It's about what you bring to the table, how you lead, and how you endure." Those words had become their creed. And as the stars shone above them, the Rangers knew that no matter where their journey took them next, they would carry those lessons with them, always. The days following their final mission had a different feel to them. The Rangers, though battle-worn and tired, had a new sense of confidence and purpose. They had proven themselves in ways they hadn't imagined possible just a few months ago. The lessons learned from each other, from their commanders, and most importantly from John Miller, had taken root in their minds. The team had been through hell and back, but they knew they weren't done yet. There was more to learn, more to do, and more to become. The gunny sergeant called them to formation one morning, his voice commanding, but also filled with a certain pride. "All right, Rangers. We've got another mission, and this one is going to test everything we've trained for. It's not just about getting in and getting out. This is going to be about strategy, teamwork, and decision-making." The Rangers listened intently, their focus unwavering. The gunny continued, "We've got a VIP target, high value. He's in a remote location, surrounded by enemy forces. This mission requires precision. No room for error. I don't need to tell you that. You've learned that already." There was a brief pause before he added, "But what I want you to remember is this. It's not just about completing the mission. It's about how you handle the responsibility. You will lead, you will follow, and you will trust each other. That's what makes you a team. That's what makes you a Ranger." The Rangers nodded. They had come a long way from the rookies who had walked onto the training grounds months ago. Now, they were ready for anything. They gathered their gear and headed out, the familiar hum of their vehicles and the weight of their packs grounding them in the reality of the mission ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they found themselves deep in hostile territory. The landscape was rugged, with jagged cliffs and thick forests that provided both cover and danger. It was the kind of place where even the smallest mistake could cost them everything. The Rangers moved carefully, using hand signals and staying alert for any signs of enemy presence. They knew that the key to survival was their ability to work together, to anticipate each other's actions without speaking a word. The closer they got to their target, the more tense the atmosphere became. The enemy forces were well organized, and the Rangers knew they would have to outthink and outmaneuver them if they were to succeed. As they neared the compound where the VIP target was being held, they came across their first major obstacle. A fortified checkpoint stood between them and their goal. The enemy was well prepared, with guards stationed at every corner and cameras watching every move. They had no choice but to take the checkpoint. We move fast. We move silent, the gunny sergeant instructed. We don't give them time to react. Once we're in, we're committed. No turning back. The Rangers didn't hesitate. They knew their plan, and they executed it with military precision. Harris, the sniper, was the first to take position. He moved quietly, finding a vantage point from which he could cover the entire area. The rest of the team split into groups, moving swiftly and silently toward their objective. As they reached the checkpoint, the plan unfolded flawlessly. Harris took the first shot, eliminating the guard on the far side of the checkpoint without a sound. The Rangers surged forward, clearing the area and neutralizing the remaining threats. The whole operation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. They had secured the area, but the hardest part was yet to come. With the checkpoint cleared, the team moved toward the compound. They were close now. Too close. The enemy was waiting for them. The final approach was the most dangerous part of the mission. They had to move quickly but cautiously, knowing that a single mistake would expose them to enemy fire. As they neared the compound's walls, the sound of footsteps echoed from the inside. "Take cover," the gunny sergeant barked, and the team dropped to the ground. The enemy was close. They could hear their voices, their footsteps growing louder. The Rangers held their breath, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "We breach on my mark," the gunny sergeant whispered. "Get ready." It was now or never. With a single motion, the gunny sergeant gave the signal, and the Rangers charged. The compound was stormed with precision, each soldier knowing exactly what to do. They took down the enemy forces with quick, silent movements. Harris, once again in his position, eliminated targets from a distance, covering the team as they moved inside. It wasn't long before they reached the room where the VIP target was being held. The door was locked, but it was no match for the Rangers. They breached it quickly, and there he was, the high-value target they had been sent to extract. They secured him and moved back through the compound. But as they made their way out, enemy reinforcements arrived. The Rangers were now in a firefight, fighting to stay alive while completing their mission. Bullets whizzed by, but the Rangers didn't flinch. They knew what they had to do. They covered each other's backs, staying focused on getting the target to safety. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the extraction point, and the helicopter arrived just in time. The moment the team boarded, they breathed a collective sigh of relief. The mission had been a success, but the cost was real. They had lost some time, and there had been close calls, but they had done it. They had worked together, trusted each other, and completed the mission as a team. Back at base, the gunny sergeant stood before them once again. "You did what needed to be done," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've proven yourselves again, and you've earned your place as Rangers. But remember this, what you've learned here goes beyond combat. It's about what you carry with you every day, your honor, your trust in each other, and your commitment to the mission. That's what defines you." The Rangers nodded, knowing the truth in his words. They had done more than complete another mission. They had become something greater, a team, a brotherhood, and most importantly, true Rangers. The days following the successful mission were a quiet reflection for the Rangers. Their bond had only grown stronger, and as they returned to their daily routines, there was a sense of satisfaction that filled the air. They had completed the task, they had made it through as a team, and they knew that they had earned something much deeper than just the title of Ranger. The gunny sergeant, as always, pushed them forward. There was no time for resting on their laurels. He knew that the moment they started feeling comfortable, they would begin to lose the edge that made them effective. The next morning, the unit gathered once again, this time in the familiar briefing room. The gunny sergeant stood at the front, his expression focused. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Rangers, you've done well. But you know as well as I do, this isn't over. The world is full of dangers that don't stop. And neither should we. Today, we focus on what comes next. We're going to keep pushing. We're going to keep training, and we're going to keep improving. You're not done yet. But you've proven something. Something bigger than just skill or tactics. You've proven that you're Rangers. And that's a title you carry for life." The words hit home for the men in the room. They had already faced the worst, and they had come out on top. The struggles, the sacrifices, had all led them to this point. And the gunny was right. They were Rangers. That title meant something. And it wasn't just about the training or the missions. It was about the way they lived, the way they led, and the way they carried each other forward. That afternoon, as they geared up for yet another mission, The thought of their journey together loomed large in their minds. They had faced impossible odds, made countless sacrifices, and had come through each challenge stronger than before. But it wasn't just about the battles they fought. It was about what they had learned along the way. What John Miller had taught them. The lessons of humility, leadership, and trust had become the foundation of everything they did. As they moved out, the landscape ahead was familiar, yet different. The harsh terrain, the unknown dangers, and the relentless pace of their missions were ever present. But so were the lessons that had become part of who they were. Every mission, every challenge, was an opportunity to prove that they were more than just soldiers. They were a brotherhood, bound by shared experience and the unspoken understanding that they would always have each other's backs. The mission went smoothly. The team moved like clockwork, their communication flawless, their movements efficient. They were no longer just individuals following orders. They were a cohesive, well-trained unit, and each of them knew that their success depended on the man beside them. As they wrapped up the operation and made their way back to base, the thought of the road ahead loomed larger than ever. They had come so far, and yet they knew there was so much more to learn, so much more to accomplish. The journey to becoming a true ranger was never complete. But as they boarded the transport vehicle and made their way back to camp, the sense of fulfillment was palpable. They had earned their place in the legacy of those who came before them. And as the sun set on another day of training, they stood together, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it as one. It was that unspoken bond, the shared understanding that they were not just soldiers but a family, that made them stronger than any challenge they would face. As they prepared for their next mission, they knew that they were ready, not just because of their training or their weapons, but because they had each other. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and it was. That bond that would see them through whatever came next. The lessons learned from John Miller and the experiences they had shared together would guide them forward, shaping them into the soldiers and the men they had always aspired to be. They were Rangers, and that title, earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, would remain with them forever. In this emotional story, a group of young Rangers goes through intense training and missions that test not only their skills, but also their ability to lead, trust, and endure. Through the ups and downs, the team learns valuable lessons from their mentors and from each other, with a special focus on the wisdom imparted by a seasoned veteran. This emotional story highlights the importance of teamwork, humility, and resilience as the Rangers face life or death decisions, pushing their physical and mental limits to become more than just soldiers, but a family. As the story unfolds, the emotional story of growth, sacrifice, and brotherhood leads the team to understand that being a Ranger is about more than just tactical expertise. It's about the bond they share and the lessons they've learned along the way. The emotional story continues as they confront new challenges, learning how to make tough decisions under pressure, proving that their training has prepared them not just to survive, but to lead with honor. In the end, this emotional story culminates in the realization that they are no longer just soldiers. They are Rangers, ready to face whatever comes next together.